They say you never really understand the value of something until it's gone. Well, in our town of Green Lake, that lesson hit like a lightning bolt, literally. On the same afternoon, the school's science fair was in full swing and kids were showing off potato batteries and vinegar volcanoes. The entire power grid collapsed. Just like that. Mid-sentence, mid-presentation, mid-lives. Lights went out, fire alarms screeched, backup systems faltered, and in the ICU down at Green Lake Memorial the monitors went black for 4 full seconds. People screamed. Generators failed. Traffic signals froze. My phone buzzed with a dozen urgent calls, but I didn't need to hear a single word. I already knew. My windmill had been sabotaged. But not by vandals. Not by a storm. No, it was the HOA president, Karen. And she'd literally chainsawed the blades off the only emergency wind turbine supplying backup power to the entire town. For aesthetic reasons. It all started 2 days earlier when I noticed something strange. My weather sensors weren't picking up the usual rotational data from the turbine on Ridgepoint Hill. I checked the diagnostics from my home server and found a series of disconnects. It wasn't mechanical failure. It was deliberate. I thought maybe a bird strike or even a snapped bearing. But when I drove up the slope behind my barn and got to the clearing, I saw the horror with my own eyes. The entire head of the turbine, the massive 3-bladed rotor that powered over 40% of our town's emergency grid, was lying in twisted pieces like a felled tree in the tall grass. Saw marks. Fresh. Jagged. Almost surgical. I didn't believe it at first. Who would even think to do such a thing? I was halfway to calling the sheriff when I spotted the note in a plastic sleeve zip-tied to the turbine base. One sentence. Your windmill violates HOA Sightline Code Section 7.4. Kindly remove all remaining parts within 48 hours or be fined $500 per day. Signed, Karen Weatherby, HOA President. Now let me explain something. I live on the outer edge of Green Lake, on the very border of what the HOA considers their jurisdiction. The windmill predates most of the neighborhood developments around here. It was approved under a FEMA Energy Independence grant nearly 12 years ago. I built it myself with guidance from licensed engineers. It's 100% legal, registered, certified, and even inspected annually. The HOA has no authority over it. None. But Karen has always had a peculiar grudge against my land. She once tried to ban my tomato greenhouse for being too red. Then she tried to declare my duck pond a mosquito hazard. And now this. She'd escalated to full-on infrastructure destruction. The worst part wasn't even the act itself, it was the timing. That very week I had been coordinating with the town's emergency services for a storm season power audit. The windmill was wired directly into the grid as a fallback relay. When storms took out primary lines, it kept the firehouse lit, the school's radios running, and the ICU on life support. All automated. All tested. Until now. And as fate would have it, the very next day a freak summer storm hit. Lightning. Down transformers. System overload. Everything went dark, and Karen's ego got its own light show courtesy of the damage she caused. After the power outage hit, I drove into town to check on the control box at the substation. What I saw left me speechless. First responders were scrambling. The school had to evacuate children in pitch black. The gas station's pump system locked up mid-fill, stranding a dozen drivers. At the hospital, emergency lights flickered unreliably, because the supplemental turbine feed was dead. I found the mayor and the fire chief standing in the rain beside a soaked fuse panel looking like they'd aged 10 years in 1 hour. When I told them what had happened, how Karen had taken it upon herself to slice the turbine down with a chainsaw, they thought I was joking. Then I showed them the note. By the next morning word had spread. Local reporters showed up. A cameraman from Channel 5 interviewed me in front of the broken turbine shell. Kids and parents from the school started showing up in droves, some holding signs that read things like "Wind power saves lives and don't let HOA stand for heartless overbearing arrogance." People were furious. And Karen? She doubled down. She posted on the HOA website that the turbine was a quote-unquote blight on the community skyline and that she had taken action to preserve neighborhood integrity. She claimed the turbine was quote dangerously outdated and could have flung debris into nearby homes, which was ridiculous considering the nearest house is 800 feet away and built from concrete slabs. The only thing the turbine had ever flung was electrons into the power grid. But I didn't just stew in silence. I began digging. I went through old emails and documentation and unearthed the full contract between my installation and the town. It clearly stated that Ridgepoint Turbine was an authorized emergency energy site. Tampering with it was not just reckless, it was a violation of a federal disaster preparedness agreement. That's when things got interesting. Because FEMA's regional office monitors data from registered microgrid sources, and the sudden blackout from my turbine triggered a flag in their system. 2 hours later I got a call from someone named Agent Lang from the Department of Homeland Security's Critical Infrastructure Unit. Yes, Homeland Security. Apparently backup energy sources tied to hospital equipment are considered vital during federally declared emergencies. Karen didn't just cut some blades off a windmill. She disabled protected infrastructure. That night a FEMA inspector showed up unannounced at my door. He wore muddy boots and looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. I handed him all the paperwork. I showed him drone footage I had taken from earlier that week showing the turbine operating normally. He asked if I had any cameras installed on-site. I said yes. What we watched next made his eyebrows nearly touch his hairline. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Karen, in a wide-brimmed hat and pearls, standing beside a man with a chainsaw. She pointed. He cut. 3 minutes later the blades fell. The next morning Karen awoke to something far worse than HOA complaints, federal inquiries. FEMA, the town's legal office, and even an energy grid consultant had launched a joint investigation. And the townspeople? They weren't sitting idle either. A volunteer group began raising funds to restore the turbine. Local teens spray-painted signs reading "Justice for Ridgepoint" and "Save Our Spinny Boy." Someone even made a 3D model of the turbine in Minecraft and posted a time-lapse rebuild video that racked up 50,000 views in a day. But me? I wasn't looking for fame or praise. I just wanted my system back online before the next storm hit. Because it wasn't about pride or ego. It was about the grandmother on oxygen 2 blocks from the substation. The teacher who needed her laptop battery to hold through a Zoom class. The firefighter who relied on radio backup when the main tower failed. That windmill didn't just spin air. It spun peace of mind. And now it was time to fight back. With law, logic, and every ounce of evidence I had. Karen had declared war on common sense, and I was about to give her a front-row seat to what happens when you mess with the wrong turbine. The day after the blackout, Green Lake was simmering. The wind had died down, but the tension hadn't. People were on edge, grocery stores ran on partial power, the traffic lights at Main and 6th were still blinking red, and parents were nervously keeping their kids indoors, uncertain whether the town's systems would fail again. Everywhere I went, someone stopped me. Some with questions. Some with gratitude. Some just to vent their outrage at how something as essential as the town's emergency power could be taken down because one woman thought it clashed with the view from her upstairs bathroom. But it wasn't just Karen's arrogance that stunned people, it was how deliberate it all was. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was someone deciding their personal opinion overrode the collective safety of an entire town. I had barely had time to grab a sandwich from Pete's Deli when my phone started lighting up again. Local officials, neighbors, and now media outlets from neighboring counties were all calling. I took a call from the mayor herself while still chewing. She asked if I could come down to the town hall immediately. Apparently, Karen had issued a public statement, and it was already causing a stir. By the time I arrived, there were more cars in the lot than I'd seen since the town's 4th of July parade. I stepped into the chamber, and the buzz hit me like a wall. Everyone was talking at once, waving phones, shaking heads, even pointing toward the projector screen at the front of the room. There it was. A full PowerPoint slideshow titled, "Restoring Neighborhood Integrity, an Urgent Aesthetic Intervention." Karen stood by it with a ridiculous laser pointer, smugly clicking through slides that included stock images of old windmills exploding, random wind turbine fires from third-world countries, and fake statistics about how spinning blades increase residential anxiety. The kicker? She claimed that my turbine had visible rust, was emitting magnetic pulses, and posed a psychological blight on local peace of mind. Never mind the fact that it was spotless, structurally sound, and designed with noise-dampening tech that made it quieter than a box fan. I didn't say a word. I just waited. As she clicked through to her final slide, a digital rendering of a sculpture park titled, "The Silent Sky," I finally raised my hand. The room turned. The mayor gestured for me to speak, and I walked calmly up to the front. I plugged in a flash drive and projected something very different. Legal documents showing the turbine's FEMA registration, its disaster readiness certification, the signed permits from the town council itself, and, finally, footage from my security camera. The crowd gasped as the screen showed Karen pointing dramatically at the windmill while a hired man revved up a chainsaw. She looked like a dictator commissioning the demolition of a monument. Karen's face turned ghostly pale, but she quickly tried to pivot. She insisted the footage was taken out of context, and that she believed the turbine was abandoned and dangerous. But the town clerk chimed in to remind everyone that only 3 months earlier she'd sent out HOA emails referencing that ugly working windmill. Her lies were crumbling faster than her approval rating. The mayor declared an immediate suspension of all HOA authority concerning infrastructure and called for a full review of their bylaws. Karen tried to argue, claiming she was only acting for the safety and beauty of the community. That's when the fire chief stood up, Chief Rowley, a quiet man who rarely spoke unless it was urgent. He cleared his throat and said, "My crew lost radio power for 12 minutes. If we'd had an active call, someone could have died. That turbine is part of our backup relay. You didn't just cut metal, ma'am, you cut lifelines." The room fell silent. For the first time in years, Karen had no comeback. By the time I left the meeting, the crowd outside had grown. Word had spread that something big had gone down. A couple of teenagers who followed the #BladeGate meme account were live streaming, giving a play-by-play to their followers. They asked for a quote. I kept it short. You can't cut corners when it comes to public safety. Or blades, apparently. It got clipped and posted within minutes, captioned, "Local hero roasts HOA villain after Powergate." But while the town was finally turning the tide, Karen wasn't finished. That evening she sent out a mass email to all HOA members, doubling down on her claim that she acted in good faith, and asserting that the turbine was not on the official Green Lake map. She even attached a blurry, outdated zoning diagram with hand-scribbled lines around a shaded area she labeled Restricted Sightline. I had to laugh. She literally tried to redraw jurisdictional borders like a 6-year-old with a crayon. Still, she had loyalists. A small, bitter faction of HOA board members started backing her narrative, mostly the same people who'd complained about things like garden gnomes, unmowed grass patches, and unauthorized bird feeders. They claimed I'd built a secret, power monopoly, and accused me of leveraging the windmill for personal clout. It was so absurd I almost ignored it, until one of them submitted a formal code violation request to the town, asking that I be fined for environmental intimidation. Whatever that meant. But something else was happening too. The people of Green Lake were organizing. Not just online but in person. A group of local parents started a petition to have Karen removed from the HOA board altogether. The Volunteer Fire Brigade pledged labor to help restore the windmill. Even the high school robotics club offered to help fabricate temporary blade extensions using their lab equipment. It wasn't just about the turbine anymore, it had become a symbol. A symbol of what happens when arrogance goes unchecked. a symbol of what one person's vendetta can do when left unchallenged. But also, a symbol of what a community can rebuild when it decides enough is enough. That night, as I stood on my back porch, I looked toward the hill where the turbine once spun. The pole was still there, a little battered but upright, catching moonlight on its steel sides. It looked lonely, like a soldier waiting for orders. My phone buzzed again. A FEMA rep was arriving the next morning to assess the damage and begin paperwork for federal prosecution. Apparently, what Karen did wasn't just HOA overreach. It might be classified as interference with critical emergency infrastructure, an actual felony. I poured myself a cup of coffee even though it was near midnight and sat down at the workbench inside my shed. I spread out sketches and parts lists and estimate. The turbine wasn't just going back up, it was going to be better, stronger, faster, more protected. Because next time someone tried to cut it down, they'd have to go through a whole town of people who now knew the truth. The windmill had been spinning quietly for years, saving lives without fanfare. But now its silence had been broken, and there was no turning back. The next morning started with a knock on my door that could have cracked the frame. When I opened it, 2 men in FEMA jackets stood on my porch with a clipboard, a toolkit, and expressions that said they had absolutely no time for nonsense. One introduced himself as Agent Briggs, and the other was a structural inspector named Melendez. I led them straight up the hill to the site, and the moment they saw the damaged turbine, their faces hardened. Melendez circled it slowly, taking photos and jotting notes, while Briggs asked me a series of rapid-fire questions. When did I last inspect the blades? When did I discover the damage? Did I know who was responsible? I handed him the printed photos from the security footage showing Karen overseeing the dismantling like some kind of suburban general. Briggs said one sentence that made my stomach churn. This may qualify as sabotage of a federally monitored energy installation. While they documented the scene, I showed them where the blades had been tossed, crudely dumped in the brush, partially hidden by some old fence panels. It was clear Karen hadn't even tried to cover her tracks. Melendez examined the break points and confirmed what I'd already known. The cuts were fresh, precise enough to suggest power tools, and targeted directly at the connection points. There was no mistaking it. Someone had purposefully disabled the windmill, and that meant the case was now going well beyond HOA drama. I drove them back down to my shop where we reviewed the internal data logs. The turbine sensors had recorded its last spin precisely at 4:16 a.m. 2 days earlier. At 4:18, it stopped transmitting. At 4:23, the system logged an abnormal torque shift consistent with force deactivation. After that, nothing. Agent Briggs nodded grimly, thanked me for my cooperation, and told me I'd likely be called as a witness should the case proceed to court. The moment they left, I sat back and realized that for the first time since this all began, the consequences were now Karen's to deal with. But I wasn't about to sit around and wait for justice. I had a windmill to rebuild, and the town needed its power. Within a few hours, the support came flooding in. I got a text from Marcus, the local machinist who used to work on farm equipment. He offered to help fabricate new blade connectors. A retired Navy electrician named Tom showed up at my door with his old welding rig and a stack of polished steel sheet. The mayor personally dropped off a check from the town emergency fund to kickstart restoration. And the GoFundMe that had been floating around? It had passed $50,000 in donations. Parents were posting online about how the windmill saved their kids' breathing machines during the last big storm. A woman from the nursing home sent me a handwritten letter that read simply, "Without your turbine, I don't know if I'd still be here." Karen, meanwhile, had gone silent. Or rather, she was being very loud behind closed doors. Word had it she was emailing HOA members obsessively, calling emergency meetings to restore her authority, claiming she was being framed by radical environmentalists. But even her closest allies were turning. The vice president of the HOA board publicly resigned, stating she wanted no part in defending reckless actions. One board member sent me a voicemail apologizing for not speaking up sooner. It was like watching a poorly constructed house finally collapse under its own arrogance. That weekend, we held the first community rebuilding event. Dozens of people came out to the hill with gloves, tools, and even coolers full of drink. There were dads in flannel, teens with Bluetooth speakers, and grandmothers handing out homemade cookies. We worked in shifts, some rebolting the base, others prepping the motor housing, and a few sanding and repainting the salvaged metal. It was hard work, but the energy was contagious. Every time someone tightened a bolt or lifted a beam, it felt like we were stitching our town back together piece by piece. Around noon, a black SUV rolled up and parked at the bottom of the hill. Karen stepped out, flanked by a man in a suit who looked as if he regretted ever answering her phone call. She didn't walk up, just stood there at the edge of the field, arms crossed, glaring at us. For a moment, the entire hill seemed to go quiet. Tools stopped. People looked up. Then Tom, the welder, muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Thought I smelled bleach and desperation." The laughter broke the tension, and the work continued. Karen stood there another 5 minutes, clearly waiting for someone to invite her up. No one did. Eventually, she got back in her SUV and drove off without saying a word. That night, the turbine stood half rebuilt, a fresh set of blades bolted into place, still untested but beautiful against the darkening sky. We lit lanterns along the trail and stayed late into the evening sharing food and stories. It wasn't just a technical project anymore, it was personal. For the first time in years, people who lived side by side but had barely spoken were now working shoulder to shoulder. Children ran around with flashlights pretending to be drone pilots. Someone brought a guitar. For a while, it felt like the blackout had flipped a different kind of switch, one that reminded us we were a community, not just neighbors. But while our town was coming together, Karen was unraveling. The next day, she filed a cease and desist letter against me, accusing me of publicly humiliating her and endangering her legacy of beautification. I didn't even need to respond. The town's legal counsel issued a formal rebuke, reminding her she was currently under investigation by both local authorities and FEMA, and that further interference could result in criminal charges. Meanwhile, the footage from my security camera had gone viral. Some clever internet user added dramatic music, slow motion, and labeled her the Chainsaw Chairwoman. It got over 1 million views. Her name became a cautionary meme. Then came the court summons. Karen was to appear before the Municipal Review Board to answer for her actions. While it wasn't a criminal trial, yet, it would determine whether the HOA had any future standing and whether Karen's role in the destruction would bar her from public office or civic duties. I was asked to testify, and while I wasn't one for revenge, I couldn't say no. The facts were clear. The damage was real. The risks were life-threatening. And someone needed to stand up and say this isn't how you run a neighborhood. The night before the hearing, I walked back up the hill to check the windmill one last time before the engineers connected it back to the grid. It stood tall, freshly painted, new blades gleaming in the moonlight. The breeze picked up, and for the first time in a week, I heard the faint whoosh of blades turning. Just once. Just enough to remind me that it would all be worth it. Not because I wanted recognition, but because when the next storm came, and it would come, we wouldn't be left in the dark again. Not by weather. And certainly not by Karen. As I stood there, my phone buzzed. A message from FEMA. Final confirmation that their office would be sending a formal complaint to the state's Attorney General, along with evidence from their investigation. Karen wasn't just facing local consequences now. She was staring down federal scrutiny. And I was just getting started. Because sometimes it takes one person's arrogance to show a town what really matters. And sometimes all it takes to fix it is wind. By the time the municipal hearing rolled around, Green Lake had reached a kind of fever pitch. The once quiet, slow-paced community had become a buzz of activity, debate, and anticipation. Posters had gone up around town with mock slogans like, "Make Wind Great Again," and Karen cut the wrong wires. Someone had even made stickers shaped like wind turbine blades with the words, "Powered by common sense," printed across them. What had begun as an act of selfish vandalism was now a full-blown civic movement. And at the center of it all, there was Karen, still clinging to the fantasy that she was some kind of misunderstood visionary rather than the architect of one of the most dangerous decisions our town had seen in decades. The hearing was held in the same chamber where Karen had once shown off her PowerPoint presentation about removing visual pollution. But now the tables were turned. Literally. She sat at the long witness table in front of the council, with two lawyers at her side, neither of whom looked particularly confident. The room was packed. There were residents standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, volunteers from the fire department, nurses from the hospital, teachers, shopkeepers, even the mayor herself sitting in the front row, arms folded. I had never seen that room so full, not even during election season. The council chair opened with a stern reminder that the hearing was not a trial but a formal review of HOA authority, with special attention to the destruction of registered emergency infrastructure. Then they called me up to speak. I walked slowly to the podium, my notes in one hand and a flash drive in the other. I didn't need to rehearse, it was all etched into memory. I started with the facts. The FEMA registration, the turbine's connection to the emergency grid, the automated override system that triggered when the main lines failed. I walked them through the timeline of the incident, showing photos of the cut blades, the damage to the relay box, and the security footage. When I played the clip showing Karen pointing while the chainsaw roared to life, a few gasps echoed across the chamber. Even Karen's own lawyers winced. But what really drove the point home was the testimony that followed. Chief Rowley took the stand and described the day the town went dark. He listed the calls that were dropped, the emergency radios that failed to connect, and the potential consequences if a fire had broken out or a medical emergency had occurred. Then came a nurse from Green Lake Memorial who explained how the ICU had gone dark for nearly 30 seconds because their backup batteries hadn't been fully charged, and how, in that window, they nearly lost a patient. By the time the third speaker finished, Karen looked like she'd been drained of her usual venom. Still, when it was her turn to respond, she snapped back into character. She claimed she had received multiple complaints about the turbine's appearance and acted under advisory authority from outdated HOA guidelines. She insisted she didn't know the turbine was active and accused me of purposefully concealing its function to avoid oversight. She tried to paint herself as a victim of a smear campaign, saying the town had turned on her unfairly. But her performance fell flat, especially when a whistleblower, none other than the HOA's former secretary, was called to testify. She brought a folder of printed emails showing that Karen had been planning to have the turbine removed for over 6 months. In one email, Karen bragged that she was sick of looking at that overgrown lawn fan and that she had a much better plan for the space. That plan, as it turned out, involved turning the hilltop into a sculpture park, funded by HOA fees and possibly named after herself. The most damning line read, "Once the windmill's gone, we can finally install something that actually inspires people, art, not spinning junk." The council members looked stunned. One even muttered something under his breath about hubris. Karen's lawyers quietly tried to push the blame onto the hired contractor, saying he had gone beyond the scope of instruction. But when the contractor was called, he threw Karen under the bus so fast it practically left tire marks. He said she had specifically directed him to make sure the blades fall in a way that doesn't damage her car, and that she'd paid him in cash with a warning to keep it off the books. At that point, the council chair took off his glasses and addressed the room. He said it was clear there had been a deliberate act of vandalism against critical infrastructure, and that the HOA had not only overstepped its boundaries but potentially endangered lives. Effective immediately, all HOA authority related to utilities, land use, or structural oversight would be suspended pending further legal review. Karen was to be removed as president, stripped of any decision-making power, and barred from seeking re-election for a minimum of 10 years. The room erupted in quiet applause. Not a cheer, not a riot, just a collective sigh of justice being served. But the story didn't end there. As I walked outside, I found a small crowd waiting near the step. A reporter with a microphone stepped up and asked if I had anything to say to Karen. I paused, looked at the wind picking up through the trees, and said, "I don't need to say anything to her. She heard the whole town loud and clear." It aired that night across 3 counties. That weekend, the turbine came fully back online. It wasn't just restored, it was upgraded. With help from the Robotics Club, we installed a new monitoring system with encrypted feedback to the grid and a backup solar array as a secondary feed. A protective barrier was built around the base with signs indicating it was a protected emergency asset. The town council officially designated it Ridgepoint Emergency Power Station 1. A commemorative plaque was installed by the community with every donor's name engraved, along with the quote, "Power isn't always loud. But when it's taken, we all feel it." As for Karen, she didn't show her face in public for weeks. Rumor had it she'd fled to her sister's house out of state while the legal storm brewed. FEMA, now fully engaged, began preparing a case for federal interference, and I was once again asked to provide documentation. They were particularly interested in the emails, the footage, and the timing of the sabotage in relation to scheduled infrastructure audits. If proven intentional, it could carry serious consequences under disaster prevention laws. Her little quest to beautify the neighborhood might just end up with a courtroom and federal charges. In the aftermath, the HOA restructured. New members were elected, people who actually listened to the residents, people who believed in community over control. One of the first motions passed was the Public Safety First resolution, ensuring that no HOA action could override town-approved infrastructure projects. It passed unanimously. I spent the next few days finally relaxing, fixing up the parts of the yard I'd neglected during the turbine repairs, and replying to the flood of thank you letters in my inbox. But more than anything, I just enjoyed the sound. The gentle hum of the blades turning in the wind again. A sound that had once blended into the background, now felt like a heartbeat for the whole town. And somewhere I imagined Karen still fuming, still trying to figure out how her perfect plan went up in flames. But it wasn't a mystery. It wasn't sabotage or politics. It was just truth catching up with her. Because when you cut down something built to help others, you don't just silence a machine, you turn everyone it protected into your witness. The morning after the turbine came back online, the town of Green Lake seemed to breathe again. The air felt different, not just from the subtle vibration of blades slicing the sky above Ridgepoint Hill, but from the collective relief that came with knowing a wrong had finally been made right. Parents waved to me as I passed. Teenagers saluted me with mock turbine dances, and I even caught the postman humming that parody song someone had made online called Spin Baby Spin. But more than anything, people had stopped looking anxious. There was no more whispering about whether the lights would go out in the next storm. The faith in infrastructure had been restored, not because a power company came through, but because neighbors stood up for something they believed in and rebuilt it themselves. The mayor called me personally to thank me for what she called extraordinary civic leadership, which felt odd considering I was just a guy who'd built a windmill because I didn't trust the old power grid. I didn't ask for recognition. But that week, the town council voted unanimously to recognize Ridgepoint Turbine as an official emergency asset under municipal protection. The nameplate was changed from Private Turbine to Green Lake Auxiliary Station 1. They even gave me a key to the city, which I accepted awkwardly during a short ceremony next to the very hill Karen once stood at, demanding its removal. Karen, however, wasn't there. She wasn't anywhere. After her removal from the HOA, she vanished. No more public statements, no emails, not even a whisper on the neighborhood grapevine. A few nosy neighbors claimed she was hiding out with family in New Hampshire, waiting for the federal heat to die down. But the heat hadn't gone anywhere. FEMA had not only confirmed the windmill's critical designation, they escalated the incident to the Office of Emergency Services, citing it as a textbook case of unauthorized interference with federally connected infrastructure. If charges were pressed, Karen could be facing real jail time. One might assume that'd be enough to close the chapter, to put the whole saga behind us. But I wasn't done yet. The truth was, I'd learned something during this ordeal. I'd learned just how fragile systems can be when people feel entitled to override them. That it doesn't take a natural disaster to threaten lives. It takes one entitled person with too much time, too little understanding, and a complete lack of consequences. So I took it a step further. I submitted a proposal to the town council to establish a new position, Green Lake Infrastructure Liaison. The role would ensure all emergency, environmental, and public utility assets were protected from private interference, with clear coordination between residents and first responders. To my surprise, they asked me to fill the role. I said yes. Not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to make sure no one like Karen ever got a second chance to cut the town's lifeline. The first thing I did in my new capacity was commission the installation of a secondary turbine. This one slightly smaller, built with the help of high school engineering students who had begged to be involved. It was installed on the south end of town, directly beside the community center. This time, it had reinforced base plating, encrypted remote control systems, and, my favorite addition, a brass plaque that read, "If you touch this turbine without approval, may the wind be against you." I also made another quiet move. I bought the lot adjacent to Karen's now vacant house. It had gone up for sale after her public disgrace, and while no one was exactly lining up to live near the scene of her downfall, I saw potential. The lot had a perfect vantage point of Ridgepoint Hill and enough open air to serve one very specific purpose. I installed a micro-windmill. Not one tied to the grid, not even one particularly functional. Just decorative. And loud. Its blades were designed to make a gentle, rhythmic creaking sound, perfectly audible from Karen's upstairs windows. It wasn't revenge. Not really. It was a reminder. A monument to her overreach. A symbol of the power she lost when she tried to take away something that never belonged to her in the first place. Months passed, and life in Green Lake returned to a kind of new normal. The town became something of a model community for emergency sustainability. FEMA used our rebuild as a case study in how small towns could protect their infrastructure through local initiative. A few students who helped rebuild the turbine even received scholarships to study environmental engineering. And me? I went back to gardening, tinkering, and occasionally speaking at town meetings when someone tried to complain about fence height or solar panel glare. The HOA, now under fresh leadership, kept things civil. No more drone surveillance of flower beds. No more threats about unapproved mailbox colors. Just sensible neighborhood management the way it should have always been. But fate had one last surprise in store. One afternoon, as I was inspecting the backup batteries connected to the turbine, a dark sedan pulled up beside the field. A woman stepped out, wearing sunglasses, heels, and a trench coat despite the 90-degree heat. It was Karen. She didn't look smug anymore. She looked tired, smaller somehow, her confidence shriveled into something barely human. She approached slowly, hands clasped together like a student approaching a principal. She didn't speak right away. Just stared at the windmill for a while, watching the blades spin in the soft summer breeze. Then she finally said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know. I didn't really understand what it did. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. I said nothing. I didn't need to." She continued anyway. "They told me I'd get fined. Maybe worse. I lost my position, my house might be seized, and people I've known for years won't speak to me." She finally turned to face me. "I don't expect you to forgive me. But I wanted to say it, even if it doesn't matter." It didn't matter. Not really. Some damage can't be undone with words. But I nodded anyway, not for her, but because I'd already moved on. There was nothing she could do now to fix the past. The windmill was spinning again. The town was safe, and she would have to live with the sound of those blades as a permanent echo of her own foolishness. She left without asking for a photo or making a scene. Just climbed back into her car and drove off down the road, smaller than the woman who once stood with a chainsaw beside a man who thought he was just doing a landscaping job. That night, as I stood beside the turbine and looked up at the stars, the blades casting soft shadows across the grass, I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. Not just for myself, but for the whole town. We had survived an act of sabotage not by hiding or complying, but by uniting and pushing back. By refusing to let someone's entitlement outweigh our safety. We didn't just rebuild a machine. We built trust. We built community. And above all, we built a future where no one person could ever turn off the lights on an entire town again. The windmill hummed softly behind me, catching the night breeze like it always had. And somewhere far away, maybe Karen sat by a window, listening to that same wind carry the sound of spinning blades into the dark. Not angry. Not gloating. Just a reminder that no matter how hard someone tries to silence progress, some things keep turning anyway.